Well, good morning to everyone. This is not the way that I think all of us expected to be hearing a message or seeing each other Sunday morning, but I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on. Friday, I sort of started to feel just a little bit off. Friday night, things started to get a little bit worse, and then Saturday morning, I woke up, and you can probably tell by my throat, my voice, and probably by the way I look. I look a bit tired and drawn out, but I woke up with a cough and chest and head and all of the symptoms that we've been told we need to be very careful about by SA Health and by ourselves, even at West Beach, telling people to be very careful and wary of these things. And because this is happening, I went and got a test this morning, a COVID test, Saturday morning, and you have to wait for about 24 to 48 hours for the results to come back. So for that reason, I'm not with you this morning. This is the only way that we can be together. And I hope we can embrace the awkwardness and keep going through this together. But excuse me while we talk about this message this morning if I sneeze or cough or whatever, but it'll probably happen. So let's just roll with it. But at least I'm not sneezing and coughing in the church, right? Where you all are. So anyway, for the last 10 weeks, for the last few weeks, we've been starting off a 10-week sermon on the Sermon of the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter number 5. And this morning we're going to keep moving through that. So the first thing I want to ask is, have either of you ever been, say, anticipating or looking forward to hearing a certain public figure that you may have followed or heard before speak in public? And have you had that eagerness and anticipation about doing it? And then when you actually gone to the place to hear them and see them, when you sat down and started listening to what they were going to say, have you ever had that experience when you thought to yourself, this is not what I was expecting. This is not what I thought this person was going to be on about. Well, there is a scene in a movie like this, and the movie is called Invictus. And this is a movie about the influence of a man named Nelson Mandela, who was the president of South Africa through the mid to late 90s. Now, I just want to quickly tell you this story about this scene in the movie. Well, Mandela comes into power. He becomes the president of South Africa. And from there, Mandela goes to this meeting place where there is a group of his followers who were predominantly the black South Africans. And they're there and they're having this meeting because now all of a sudden the Mandela government have come into power. And there was a lot of tension back in South Africa in these days. So what happens is Mandela goes to this meeting out in a rural destination where all of his followers are there and they're all happy and they're all cheering because they've finally got the power. Anyway, Mandela turns up because he knows that that these group of people have just passed a vote. And that vote is that they are going to take away the name of the Springboks, who was the name of the South African rugby team. There was all this chanting about taking away the colours and the Springbok name. And they said they were doing this because they felt they had suffered years of oppression and bad treatment. So it was their turn now. They were in power to disempower or take away what their opposition valued. So what happens is Mandela turns up. And of course, he's their hero, right? And all these people are expecting a celebration of finally taking away the Springboks and gaining back power. And Mandela walks in and he goes, I know about the vote you just passed. And I know that you want to take away the Springboks from them. And then Mandela looks at them all and they're all silent and they're all listening to him and he says, we cannot do that. We must give it back to them. Now, all of them are absolutely shocked. As I said, this is the last thing they were expecting to hear from their leader. And Mandela goes on and he says, if we do not give this back to them, something they value, something they honor, something they love, something that is a symbol of who they are, then we will lose them and we will remain divided. And he goes on and he says, for the healing and the growth of our nation, we must be united. We can't do what they expect us to do. It's a very powerful and challenging story. And there is a similar story to what we're going to look at this morning about a crowd of people who are actually gathering to hear someone speak. And as they gather and they hear this person speak, they don't hear exactly what they were expecting to hear. But before we get to that, I want to set the scene and just read our passage from the Bible, which comes from the Gospel of Matthew. As we said, we're going through chapter 5, and today's verses are 17 to 20. So let me read that for us. This is what it says. This is Jesus speaking. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And we need to pause for a moment. And I want us to focus on verse 17 and ask ourselves the question, what was Jesus doing or saying to make people think that that abolishing the law was his message? Why did they think that? And why was he actually saying that wasn't the reason why he came? But the main question is, why were people thinking that was the reason why he had come to abolish the law? And we can see that was the case because another way of saying what Jesus said in verse 17 is like Jesus turns up and he says, I know what you've been suggesting, that I had come here to get rid of or abolish the law, the Old Testament law. And then it's like he says, well, let me tell you something. It couldn't be more wrong. It's quite the opposite. I have not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it or to complete it. So why? Why did he say this? Why does it seem that Jesus why did it seem that Jesus had the impression that the crowd were thinking that Jesus had come to abolish the law? Well, again, let's stop. Let's stop for a moment and think about that. This guy named Jesus from Nazareth, right? Who for the first 30 years of his life was basically a bit of a nobody. And then all of a sudden, this quiet handyman from this tiny and unremarkable little town, he turns up to the River Jordan, right? And he's baptized by his cousin, John the Baptist. And then from here, things start to get really, really interesting. Until that, he was just another individual in a small little town. But now it gets interesting. You see, before the voice of Jesus started to echo around the streets of Israel, with some of those familiar cries of repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near, and the other one of come and follow me. Before his voice was saying those things, the dominant voice of the people of Israel had come from the mouths of people called Pharisees or scribes, or you would have heard it before in our passage, teachers of the law. Pharisees or scribes. But if you don't know much about Pharisees and scribes, well, they were basically the leaders of the Jewish religion. And they reminded all of the Jewish people about the importance of following the rules, of following the traditions, and following the customs of the Jewish religion. The Pharisees and the scribes were intense when it came to following rules, tradition, and especially the outward, external practices of their religion. But then this Jesus from Nazareth turns up and he starts talking, and the people really start to listen and to actually take note of him. They saw and they heard something completely different in this Jesus. Where the Pharisees were focused on the outward expressions of Jewish religion, such as, the sacrifice and the temple and the keeping of the law, Jesus was more interested and was talking about what was inside of a person. Not the external act, but the internal struggle and the internal truths of a person. Where the Pharisees were busy laying this heavy law on people's heads and explaining the significance of it and the importance of keeping it, Jesus was getting around forgiving people and talking about grace and talking about mercy. And it wasn't just the differences in teaching and tradition. Jesus was actually a friend to those who the Pharisees and the scribes absolutely despised. Jesus was their friend. Jesus sat with, he invited, he spoke with, and he ate with the ones with the Pharisees and that would think they are the worst of the worst, the worst of the worst. He sat with the publicans, with the tax collectors, the prostitutes, all the riffraffs and all the sinner of Jesus' contemporary society were his friends. They were his friends. As Jesus sat around and sat with and spoke with all these outcasts, the people began to say to one another, who is this guy? I mean, he's not quoting the Old Testament like the Pharisees do. Maybe he's going to get rid of the Old Testament. Maybe he's going to get rid of it. There might have been some even excitement at this. Maybe he's going to offer us something new that will replace the Old Testament law. And the people were waiting for something new. They were absolutely sick and tired of the oppressive, controlling, and the self-righteous Pharisees. It had gotten that bad. Listen to this. Listen to some of these examples. There are some rules that the Pharisees had actually made for Sabbath. And Sabbath, if you're not sure what this is, it's supposed to be a day of rest, and it's reflective of the seventh day after creation where God himself rested. And in the Jewish religion, it was very important. And this is what the Pharisees actually expected of the Jewish people on the day of Sabbath. Now, they taught that it's okay if you want to look. No, actually, they said you could not look in a mirror on Sabbath because you might be tempted to pluck out one of those grey hairs, and that would be classified as reaping, farming, a sense of working. So you weren't allowed to look in the mirrors on Sabbath day. They also said it was okay if you wanted to spit, but when you did, you had to do it on a rock. Because if you spat in the ground, that could turn into mud, and mud could be used as mortar. And then mortar, you might be able to do some work with that as a handyman or as a construction worker. So if you were spitting, you had to make sure it went on a rock. They also said, the Pharisees also told the Jewish people that you could only eat an egg which had been laid on Sabbath, get this, if you killed the chicken who laid it first for breaking Sabbath. I mean, these rules are bizarre. You could imagine this, right? After living under these ridiculous expectations, you could understand that when they started to see Jesus and to hear Jesus, that some of these people maybe started to get excited, right? Maybe they were finally going to be rid of this life-sapping law that had been weighing on them for so long. You see, the law of God had become so twisted and so warped that it was no longer seen as something to be honored. It was no longer be seen as something to be looked towards and to be desired. So Jesus' first words in chapter 17 of today might have taken the wind, absolutely knocked him to the ground. And why? Because Jesus didn't say that he was going to get rid of this thing that for many of them was like a nagging sort of thorn in their side. He didn't even say he was going to lower the law, make it easier. But what he said was he was going to fulfill it and even raise it. He was going to fulfill it and he was going to raise it. Now, I think the notion of raising it is pretty clear throughout the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says things like, where you have heard it say, do not commit adultery or do not commit murder. He says, I say to you, if you even think about these things, you will have committed them in your heart. So Jesus raised the standards, not just here in the Sermon on the Mount. He raises them over and over again. We see that throughout the Gospels. But I think the more complicated question is how did Jesus fulfill the Old Testament law? How did he do that? I think we understand, raising it. We understand, we hear where he's done that. But how did he fulfill the Old Testament law? Well, there are some people that would suggest that he fulfilled the Old Testament law by the things he said. Other people might suggest by the way he lived, the things that he did. And both of those questions are right, partly. But there is more than that. Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law, not only by what he said and did, but I would suggest by primarily who he was, who he is. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the Old Testament law was divided into three parts, and they were civil law, moral law, and ceremonial. Civil, moral, ceremonial. Now, the civil law was basically the laws that maintained order in the Jewish nation, what we would call state law. And they were things around, the law or the rules around theft, divorce, or damage to goods or property or assault, those sort of things. The moral laws are direct commandments from God. They are to do this and don't do that are found within the Bible. A good example of the moral law is the Ten Commandments. And the ceremonial law, well, this type of law related to Israel's worship and how they conducted themselves in worship. And it included the things like, you would say, animal sacrifice, ritualistic washings, and then certain dietary restrictions and recommendations that they had to adhere to. So those three, the civil, moral, and ceremonial, are what we are talking about when we talk about the Old Testament law. So the next question is, how did Jesus fulfill these laws, right? Because he said he was going to do that, didn't he? He said, I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Well, Jesus did fulfill not only the law, but his word. He said he was going to do that, and he did. Now, he fulfilled the civil law when he died on the cross. How so? Well, when Jesus finally died on the cross, he was sent there by the Jewish leaders. Now, that was the final rejection of the Messiah by the nation of Israel. And that moment was the moment when God actually stopped dealing with the nation of Israel just for that time being, specifically for that time being. Jesus' death on the cross finalized that. And it was from there that God, through Jesus and through the Holy Spirit, began to build his church, to expand out from the nation of Israel. And we read about that in the New Testament. So that's the civil law. That's how he fulfilled the civil law, by dying on the cross. And what about the moral law? Well, he fulfilled that too. And he fulfilled that by living the life that you or I could not live. Every law that was laid down by God, every moral law, every expectation and standard that God laid down before humanity, no one kept it, but Jesus did. And he lived the perfect life that no one else could. That's how he kept the moral law, by being morally and living a perfectly moral life. And lastly, we have the ceremonial law. Well, you know what? Surprise, surprise. He fulfilled that too. And you want to know how he fulfilled that? Again, he died on the cross. You see, when Jesus died on the cross, all of the ceremonial system and law came to an end. It tells us in chapter 27 of Matthew that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And through this, the whole Levitical, priestly, and ceremonial system was done. It was finished. There was no need for it after that. There was now a new way into relationship with God. All of the law of the Old Testament had actually been fulfilled at this stage. And it had been fulfilled in and through Jesus. And it was by who he was, being the sinless Son of God who died on the cross, that all of this is made possible. People often jump over the Old Testament, and they sort of rush into the New Testament, all the fun stories and the interesting narratives that we find in the book of Acts and the Gospels. But you know what? The whole Old Testament is Jesus Christ as well. From front to back, it all points to him and to his coming and to his fulfilling of the messianic promises. The law itself couldn't make anyone righteous. The New Testament tells us that again and again and again. The law has actually been described as a mirror. It can show us our dirty face, but it cannot clean us. Jesus had to come to do what the law couldn't do. It couldn't save us, and it couldn't reconcile us to God. But Jesus could. And he came and he did that. And in that truth, in that story, there is more hope, more comfort, and more depth than any other story we could share with each other. Ciao, my friends.